The story begins not with a storm, not with a crime scene, but with silence. The kind of silence that lingers long after it should have been broken, after a dinner should have been eaten, after a child's laughter should have echoed across the small front yard, after a neighbor should have waved from across the fence. In the late summer of 1988, a quiet neighborhood wrapped in the ordinary routines of working families, school buses, and backyard gardens found itself holding a secret it could never quite let go of. Inside a modest two-story home, a table had been set for two. The cutlery gleamed faintly in the dim light. Plates rested on placemats patterned with small flowers, as if waiting patiently for hands that never returned to pick up forks. In the living room, a toy truck lay tipped over, its tiny wheels frozen mid-spin, and in the hallway, a pair of shoes sat neatly side by side. To the casual passerby, the house looked like any other, paint fading on the siding, curtains pulled halfway shut against the setting sun. But once you stepped closer, once you let your gaze linger, it became clear that something had broken the natural rhythm of life here. Neighbors would later recall that the night had felt strangely heavy. One woman swore she saw a light flicker in the upstairs window just after midnight. Another remembered that the curtains, usually drawn tight for privacy, were left hanging open, swaying slightly as though someone had rushed past them. The family's car sat in the driveway untouched. The following morning, the mail was left uncollected. No voices, no footsteps, no sign of life. It was as though the occupants of the home had simply stepped out into the evening air and never returned. The missing were a mother in her 30s and her only child, a boy no older than 7. To those who knew them, they were not the kind of people who simply disappeared. The mother was known for her punctuality, her soft voice, her constant watch over her son, whose boundless energy filled the corners of the block. Their lives were unremarkable in the way that makes them comforting to observe. Ordinary routines, quiet habits, little rituals that made sense only to the two of them. And yet, on that night, everything fell out of sequence, leaving only an unbroken hush behind. The house itself began to feel like a character in the unfolding mystery. Its walls, painted in faded tones, seemed to hold on to echoes too faint to hear. The kitchen, with its unwashed dishes still in the sink, looked like a play suddenly abandoned by its actors. Even the family's front steps carried a strange weight. Weeds grew unchecked between the cracks as weeks turned into months, and the doorway that once welcomed friends and neighbors became an entrance to unanswered questions. In those first few days, before police were called, before the headlines began to form, it was the silence that unsettled the most. Neighbors knocked at the door, then stood uneasily on the porch when no answer came. Someone tried the handle, locked. Another pressed an ear to the wooden frame, listening for any sound. There was none. Even the family cat, usually seen darting across the yard, had vanished. And so, the mystery did not announce itself with violence or chaos. It began with absence, with a home that had been left intact but hollowed of its purpose. People still walked past it on their way to work or school, but they did so quickly, avoiding the windows that seemed to look back at them. They wondered, had the mother run away? Had someone taken them? Had something unspeakable happened within those quiet walls? It is in this silence that the story takes root. A silence that stretches, that gathers weight, that asks questions no one dares to answer. For decades, this absence would linger, as heavy as the air in an attic closed for too long. And what no one knew then was that high above those untouched rooms, sealed away behind beams and insulation, something waited. Something that would not reveal itself until the house was forced open years later, when time and dust finally gave way to truth. This is where the story begins, not with discovery, but with disappearance. Not with clarity, but with an emptiness that echoes through the decades. A mother and son gone without a trace, and a house left behind to keep their silence. She was not the kind of woman who drew attention when she entered a room. Friends and relatives often described her as softly present, a woman who lived in the margins, who smiled politely at gatherings, who listened more than she spoke. Her name has faded from newspaper clippings and is remembered differently by those who once knew her, but what they all agree upon is this: she carried herself with a quiet strength that was rarely recognized until it was gone. In her early 30s, she was raising her son alone, navigating a life that seemed outwardly ordinary but carried invisible weight. Her days were made of rituals. Each morning she woke before the sun, brewed a pot of coffee she rarely finished, and packed her son's small backpack with care, sandwiches neatly wrapped, a folded napkin, sometimes a note with a simple message scrawled in her careful handwriting: "Be brave today or I love you more than the stars." She worked a modest job that kept the lights on and food on the table, but it was clear her world revolved around her boy. Neighbors recalled how she walked him to school every morning, never in a rush, always holding his hand a second longer than most parents did before letting go. The boy, barely 7, was a whirlwind of life in contrast to his mother's quietness. He had hair that refused to be tamed, eyes that sparkled with unfiltered curiosity, and a laugh that carried across backyards. He collected rocks, scraps of shiny foil, and anything that glittered. He told elaborate stories about rockets and planets, declaring with childlike certainty that he would one day live on the moon. When he wasn't outside running in circles, he could be found sprawled on the living room rug with crayons, sketching lopsided stars and stick-figure astronauts. His drawings often made their way to the refrigerator, taped proudly in rows that turned the kitchen into a gallery of innocence. Though the mother adored her son, those closest to her sensed something beneath the surface, an undercurrent of unease. She often checked the locks twice, sometimes 3 times before bed. She pulled the curtains closed as though shielding them not just from sunlight, but from watchful eyes. A friend once recalled her asking, almost casually, "Do you ever feel like someone is following you?" The friend laughed it off at the time, assuming she was speaking in metaphor. But looking back, the words took on a heavier meaning. Photographs from that period, though rare, capture this contrast with startling clarity. In one, the boy beams proudly beside a snowman, cheeks flushed pink with cold, eyes alight with joy. Behind him stands his mother, her smile faint, almost reluctant, as though she were performing happiness rather than inhabiting it. Yet her arm rests protectively on her son's shoulder, her grip firm, her body angled toward him like a shield. The love is unmistakable, but so too is the quiet storm behind her eyes. Relatives have said she came from a difficult past, though few details were ever shared. There were hints of strained relationships, of a life she had left behind but never fully outrun. A brother once described her as someone who carried secrets like they were folded notes in her pocket. Whatever those secrets were, she kept them locked inside, speaking of them only in half-finished sentences and fleeting expressions. Her son, in contrast, had no concept of secrets. To him, the world was wide open. He was known for knocking on neighbors' doors just to ask if they wanted to see his newest drawing, or for chasing butterflies until dusk without realizing the hour. It was his openness, his brightness, that made the darkness of their disappearance so unbearable. To imagine his laughter cut short was to imagine the sudden dimming of a light everyone had grown used to. Together, they were a portrait of contradiction, a cautious, almost withdrawn mother and her exuberant, fearless child. Yet those contradictions only made them more human, more vivid in memory. They balanced each other, the mother grounding the boy with quiet structure, the boy pulling his mother back into moments of joy. One without the other seemed unthinkable. When people spoke of them after the disappearance, it was always in pairs. No one ever mentioned her without him, or him without her. They were bound, not just by blood, but by the fragile thread of survival they spun together. To the outside world, they were simply another small family trying to make life work. To those who looked closer, they were a story of tenderness laced with unease, of laughter shadowed by quiet dread. It is in remembering them, the mother's watchful eyes, the boy's restless energy, that the tragedy of their absence takes shape. They were not just names in a file or faces on a missing poster. They were lives in motion, cut short mid-sentence. They were love and fear, hope and hesitation, 2 voices silenced on the same night. And though decades have passed, those who once knew them still recall the feeling of being near them, the warmth of a child's unguarded joy, and the unshakable sense that his mother was holding something unspoken inside her chest. That unspoken weight would later resurface in the most unexpected place, hidden in the shadows above their home, where dust and silence preserved the fragments of their lives. But in 1988, before the world knew to look upward, all anyone saw was the outline of a mother and son walking hand in hand, vanishing into the dusk. The night itself was unremarkable, cool air drifting through the trees, a sky scattered with stars, the hum of distant traffic that lulled most of the neighborhood to sleep. Yet within that ordinary frame, something happened that fractured time. The mother and son, who had gone about their evening in their familiar rhythm, were gone by morning. What took place inside those walls in the hours before midnight would never be fully known, but the traces they left behind told a story of interruption, of something halted mid-breath. The dinner table was set for 2, plates placed neatly as though the meal had only just been served. One glass of milk remained half full, the other untouched. A fork rested at an angle, as if dropped in a sudden hurry. The kitchen clock ticked on, unbothered by the absence of its keepers. In the hallway, the boy's backpack leaned against the wall, straps unfastened, crayons poking out of the front pocket. Upstairs, his bed was unmade, sheets tangled as though he had bounced on it before bedtime, a half-finished drawing lying on the floor. These were not the details of a planned departure. They were the fingerprints of a life cut short mid-motion. Neighbors who lived across the street would later recall small details that gained weight only in hindsight. One thought she saw headlights pulling slowly out of the driveway sometime around midnight, but she could not be sure, it might have been a passing car. Another insisted she heard a door slam, but dismissed it at the time as the wind. A man walking his dog said he noticed the mother's curtains drawn wider than usual, swaying slightly, as though someone had moved them aside quickly. No one reported screams, no one heard breaking glass, no one saw a struggle. It was as though the night swallowed its own noise. When police reconstructed the timeline, they found themselves chasing shadows. The last confirmed sighting was in the early evening, a neighbor waving as the boy rode his bike in the driveway, his mother watching from the porch. After that, the trail went cold. There were no phone calls, no notes left behind, no signs of forced entry. The car, a modest sedan, sat unmoved in the driveway. Her purse remained on the counter, wallet untouched, keys on the hook by the door. If she had intended to leave, she would have needed those things. If someone had taken them, why leave behind the most practical means of escape? Detectives walked through the house the next morning, notebooks in hand, searching for meaning in ordinary objects. They paused at the shoes lined up by the door, her flats, his sneakers, both waiting as though their owners might return at any moment to slip them back on. They noted the faint scent of coffee lingering in the kitchen, as though brewed but never drunk. They studied the boy's scattered toys, arranged in ways that only a child would understand. Nothing pointed to violence, nothing pointed to departure. Everything pointed to interruption. And yet, in the absence of clear evidence, the imagination began to fill the void. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that the mother had run away to escape something in her past, taking her son with her. Others suggested a darker possibility, that someone had been watching the family, waiting for the perfect moment. A few went so far as to hint that the mother herself had done something unthinkable, though no one could reconcile that with the love she so clearly held for her child. In the silence of the missing, speculation became its own kind of truth. The house itself began to feel heavy with questions. Neighbors walking past would slow their steps, glancing at the windows as though they might reveal the secret inside. Children whispered that the rooms were haunted, that if you listened closely you could hear footsteps upstairs. Adults shook their heads, uneasy, unwilling to admit that the quiet of the house unsettled them too. It stood as a monument to something unsaid, something unresolved. Time has a way of distorting memory, but even in those first days, one feeling dominated: incompleteness. The disappearance was not like a sudden storm tearing through the neighborhood, leaving debris in its wake. It was like a candle snuffed out mid-glow, the smoke still rising, the scent still lingering. Everything remained in place, but the life that animated it had vanished. And so the night became a fracture line in the timeline of the community. Before, there was the simple presence of a mother and her boy, their lives ordinary and visible. After, there was only the hollow of their absence. The neighborhood, once filled with the familiar comfort of routine, was left with unease, a sense that the world could change without warning, that a life could vanish between one breath and the next. That fracture would never fully heal. It would widen over the years as questions went unanswered, as files gathered dust, as voices faded. And yet, unknown to anyone walking through those rooms in 1988, part of the answer was already there, hidden above them, resting in the rafters where no one thought to look. The official investigation began, as they so often do, with urgency and hope. Officers knocked on doors, canvassed the neighborhood, and interviewed anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. At first, there was the assumption that answers lay just beneath the surface, that someone had noticed a strange car, a stranger loitering, or perhaps had seen the mother and son walking late at night. But as the hours turned into days, the optimism dulled into unease, and unease hardened into frustration. Inside the precinct, their files sat on a desk already crowded with other cases, but this one felt different. A mother and child vanishing together carried a particular weight. Detectives scribbled timelines on whiteboards, circled possible suspects, mapped out connections. Yet each lead crumbled upon inspection. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransom demands, no credit card activity, no bus or train tickets purchased under their names. It was as though they had dissolved into thin air. The lead detective at the time described the house as a place where life had been paused, not ended. He remembered walking through the kitchen, his shoes echoing too loudly on the tile, feeling as though he was intruding on a secret. Every object he touched, her purse, the boy's toy car, the notes on the refrigerator, seemed to whisper of a life that should have continued but hadn't. His report noted how unusual it was: no broken windows, no evidence of violence, no witnesses. In truth, he admitted privately to colleagues, he had nothing to hold on to. The search widened. Officers combed through nearby parks, wooded areas, and abandoned lots. Volunteers joined, forming lines through tall grass, calling the boy's name into the wind. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to clothing for scent, their handlers tugging at leashes as they veered toward faint trails that ended abruptly. Helicopters scanned from above, their spotlights carving through the darkness, illuminating only the ordinary landscape. Every effort ended in nothing. As the days passed, the narrative around the mother began to shift. Investigators, unable to find evidence of abduction, turned to the possibility that she had left willingly. They dug into her past, uncovering fragments of a life she had rarely spoken about, strained family ties, a failed relationship, hints of debts. To some detectives, this painted the picture of a woman under pressure, perhaps desperate enough to flee. To others, it suggested she might have been hiding from someone. But none of it explained why she would leave her purse, her keys, her car, her son's belongings. None of it explained why no one ever saw them again. Theories multiplied. Some officers suspected an estranged partner might have resurfaced, though no solid evidence pointed that way. Others considered the possibility of foul play by a stranger, but there were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, no trail to follow. The case quickly became a mirror, reflecting the fears and assumptions of whoever studied it. For the community, the investigation felt like an endless cycle of raised hopes and abrupt dead ends. Each new search brought whispers of answers, only for silence to return. Families left casseroles on the porch of the empty house, prayers were said in churches, children asked their parents if the boy would come back to school. The lack of resolution gnawed at everyone. People needed the comfort of explanation, even a painful one. Instead, they received only the steady erosion of certainty. Months later, the file was thinned into what investigators grimly called a cold case. Boxes of notes, photographs, and statements were stacked together, gathering dust in evidence rooms. The detectives moved on to other cases, but many admitted the disappearance lingered with them. One officer said he would sometimes drive past the house long after his involvement had ended, staring at the darkened windows, wondering what he had missed. The contrast between the bustling machinery of law enforcement and the stillness of the unanswered mystery was stark. Police worked through procedure, running down every possibility, while the house remained untouched, holding whatever secret it contained. The maps pinned with red markers, the binders filled with interviews, the endless questions scribbled across notepads, all of it amounted to an elaborate maze that led nowhere. In the end, what remained was absence dressed in paperwork. Officially, the mother and son were missing persons. Unofficially, they were ghosts in the system, their names resurfacing only when a new detective inherited the file, flipping through the yellowing pages with the same hope, the same dread, the same inevitable disappointment. And yet, for all the exhaustive searches and procedural rigor, not one investigator thought to look up. Not one paused beneath the ceiling beams of that modest home and asked what secrets might be resting in the space above. The attic, dusty and sealed, escaped their notice. It waited in silence, carrying the fragments of a story that the machinery of law enforcement could not reach. The investigation ended not with an answer, but with a void. A mother and child, reduced to case numbers. A family portrait turned into an unsolved puzzle. And a house, quiet and watchful, holding on to something the detectives had missed. As weeks turned into months, and months stretched into years, the absence of the mother and son stopped being treated as an active investigation, and began to live in whispers. The community, left without resolution, did what people so often do in the face of unanswered questions. It turned the disappearance into a story. What began as cautious conversations on porches slowly transformed into folklore, reshaped by time, memory, and fear. At first, neighbors spoke of them with tenderness. The boy's friends left drawings on the porch steps, as if he might return to collect them. A teacher kept his desk in the classroom empty, pencils still tucked in the tray, erasers worn down to stubs. The mother's co-workers recalled how she always hummed under her breath while filing paperwork, and for a while they paused when they passed her desk, expecting the quiet tune to float back into the air. But as time passed, the tender remembrance hardened into unease. The longer they remained missing, the more people filled the silence with their own explanations. By the early 90s, children dared one another to ride their bikes past the house at dusk, claiming that if you looked into the upstairs window, you could see the boy's reflection staring back. Others whispered that the mother's voice could sometimes be heard humming in the kitchen. None of these stories held truth, but in a community starved of answers, they spread like ivy. Parents warned their children not to linger near the house. Couples crossing the street held hands a little tighter when they passed by. What had once been a home was now treated as a haunted relic. At barbecues and church gatherings, speculation filled the air. Some were convinced the mother had been hiding from someone dangerous, that she had taken her son and fled in the middle of the night. Others shook their heads, pointing out the shoes left by the door, the purse abandoned on the counter, details that suggested no plan, only suddenness. A darker rumor whispered that she had harmed her child, or that they had harmed each other, though no one who truly knew them could reconcile such a thought with the warmth they had shared. And yet, people repeated the possibility anyway, because stories of tragedy, however unlikely, give people a way to contain their fears. The house itself added fuel to the myths. Though it eventually changed hands, for long stretches it sat empty, blinds drawn, weeds climbing the steps. In those periods, it seemed less like a home and more like a silent witness. Teenagers broke in on dares, later claiming they heard footsteps in the attic or saw toys moving in the corner. Local police would chase them out, shaking their heads, but even officers admitted there was something unsettling about walking through those rooms. The stillness clung to the walls, heavy and watchful, as if the house itself resented intrusion. Over time, the disappearance slipped from the news, replaced by newer tragedies. But locally, it remained an ever-present ghost story. Parents invoked it to warn their children about strangers. Teenagers used it as the setting for late-night dares. Even adults, who knew better than to put stock in myths, lowered their voices when the subject came up, as if speaking too loudly might summon something best left undisturbed. What struck many was not just the fact of their disappearance, but the intimacy of it. Crimes in big cities were one thing, faceless, distant, easily explained away as the world out there. But this had happened on their street, in a house that looked like theirs, to people they had waved to only days before. It was the kind of reminder no one wanted, that safety was a fragile illusion, and that life could unravel quietly, without warning. Children who grew up in that neighborhood carried the story into adulthood. Some remembered it with a chill, others with a kind of sadness they couldn't fully name. A few confessed that for years afterward, they dreamed of the boy, still wandering barefoot through the streets, trying to find his way home. The story was never just about them, it became about the people who remained, about how a community tried to make sense of a void it could not fill. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more it became less about facts and more about feelings, fear, guilt, pity, dread. Even those who had barely known the mother or son felt a strange closeness to them, as if their absence had imprinted itself on the neighborhood's collective memory. The story was told and retold, altered slightly each time, shaped by whoever was speaking. In this way, the disappearance became not only a mystery but a kind of inheritance. It was passed down in hushed tones, carried into new generations who hadn't even been alive in 1988. The names blurred, details shifted, but the essence remained, a mother and child gone without a trace, a house that refused to let go of its silence. It is a strange thing, how the human mind works when confronted with what cannot be explained. Some choose to push it away, to bury the unanswerable under distraction. Others turn absence into legend, letting fear and imagination intertwine until it feels almost real. In this community, the latter prevailed. The mystery became a story told around kitchen tables and under streetlights, a story that both frightened and fascinated, that bound the people together in their shared uncertainty. And yet, for all the rumors and ghost stories, no one could have predicted the truth. No one could have imagined that the very house they whispered about, the very attic they dared not climb into, was not just haunted by memory, but was literally holding on to what they sought. Years passed, and the house, like all houses, could not remain empty forever. Families moved in, drawn by its modest size, its affordable price, or simply by necessity. On paper it was just another property, stripped of its tragedy by real estate listings that described it in terms of square footage and charming character. Yet for those who stepped across its threshold, the air always felt different. It was a home, yes, but also a container of silence, a place where something unseen pressed against the edges of daily life. The first family to move in after the disappearance tried to treat it as a fresh start. They repainted the walls, replaced the worn curtains, and filled the rooms with laughter. For a while, it seemed to work. Children's toys spilled across the floor again, the smell of dinners drifted out into the street, and neighbors sighed in relief at the return of ordinary life. But soon, small disturbances began to creep in. The new residents noticed doors left ajar that they were sure they had closed, objects misplaced only to reappear in strange corners, the faint sound of something shifting above the ceiling at night. They chalked it up to settling wood, to memory lapses, to nerves. Still, the attic, barely touched, became a place no one wanted to linger. The father of that family once admitted to a neighbor that he had tried to store boxes up there, but the space felt wrong. The air was staler than it should have been, the floorboards creaked with a peculiar heaviness, and after only a few minutes he found himself retreating, breath shallow, heart pounding for no clear reason. His wife laughed it off at first, but she too avoided the attic, insisting she could never quite catch her breath when standing inside it. Eventually, the boxes were moved back down, piled instead into closets where they crowded the rooms below. When that family eventually left, citing a new job opportunity, though some whispered they simply couldn't stay, another moved in. This second family brought different energy. They were practical people, uninterested in neighborhood gossip. But even they found themselves drawn into the atmosphere of the house. Their youngest daughter refused to sleep in her room, claiming she heard footsteps above her ceiling. She told her parents that sometimes she could hear a boy talking softly, though no words were ever distinct. Her parents, unwilling to indulge what they saw as imagination, dismissed it as childish fear. But at night, when the house was quiet, they too admitted to hearing faint creaks that did not match the rhythms of a normal home. The community, watching these cycles, began to talk more openly about the house's effect on its occupants. It became known as the place where families never stayed long. Each set of residents seemed to carry away the same unease, even if they didn't speak of it directly. Some left within months, others after a year or two, always with vague explanations, "It just didn't feel right," or "We needed a change." What made the atmosphere most unsettling was not anything overtly supernatural. There were no objects flying through the air, no doors slamming of their own accord. Instead, it was subtler, psychological. The house seemed to amplify small fears, to press on the edges of comfort until ordinary life felt slightly distorted. Shadows seemed darker there. Silence seemed heavier. And always, the attic loomed above, avoided, its door sealed more often than not by a simple padlock or layers of insulation that homeowners told themselves they would deal with someday. Visitors felt it too. Friends coming over for dinner sometimes commented on the way sound carried strangely in the living room, how footsteps upstairs seemed delayed, like echoes arriving too late. Children on sleepovers rarely made it through the night. They would call their parents in tears, begging to go home without being able to explain why. Even pets behaved oddly. Dogs would bark at the ceiling, tails low, and cats refused to climb the staircase. And yet, life continued within its walls. Birthdays were celebrated, arguments were had, televisions flickered into the night. The house absorbed it all, layer upon layer, like rings inside a tree trunk. But beneath those layers was something constant, an undercurrent of unease that never quite lifted. Over the years, ownership shifted again and again, the property passing hands more often than any other on the block. Some buyers didn't stay long enough to even unpack properly. Others tried to embrace the house's history, telling themselves it was only superstition, but eventually admitted to feeling drained, restless, watched. Realtors would rebrand the home with new paint and fresh listings, but the neighborhood always remembered. The legend of the vanished mother and son clung stubbornly to its frame, no matter how many times it was sold. It was during one of these cycles, years later, after several families had come and gone, that renovations began. A couple, determined to make the house fully theirs, decided to open up unused spaces and modernize. They tore out old carpets, knocked down unnecessary walls, and eventually turned their attention upward. Behind a layer of insulation, they found the outline of a door, sealed, nailed, almost forgotten. Until that moment, the attic had always been peripheral, a place avoided, ignored, written off as useless space. But now it returned to focus, pressing its presence back into the lives of those who lived beneath it. The sealed door whispered of something left behind, of time frozen above their heads. And though they could not yet know it, what rested there would change everything. The discovery of the sealed attic door came almost by accident. The couple who now owned the house had been pulling away layers of old insulation, determined to reclaim every inch of their property. It was during this process that the husband's gloved hand struck something solid, a flat plane of wood hidden behind fiberglass and nails. At first, he thought it was just another panel of outdated construction, but as he cleared away more, the rectangular outline of a door emerged, faint but undeniable. There was a pause between him and his wife as they stared at it, dust motes drifting in the shaft of light from a nearby bulb. In that silence, both felt the weight of the discovery, not just because it promised additional storage space, but because it raised questions neither had considered before. Why had someone taken the trouble to seal it off so thoroughly? What was it they didn't want others to see? The husband joked at first, trying to cut the tension, "Maybe it's just an old crawl space. Probably nothing." But his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. His wife, brushing dust from her sleeves, muttered that they should probably leave it alone until they knew more. Still, neither of them walked away. They stood there, staring at the sealed frame, as if waiting for it to reveal its own truth. Over the next few days, the attic door seemed to weigh on them both. They mentioned it casually to friends who visited, half expecting laughter and dismissal, but instead the responses were strangely hesitant. One neighbor, after hearing about the sealed space, pursed her lips and said softly, "Well, every house has its secrets." Another, older woman who had lived on the block since the 1980s, grew quiet when the attic was mentioned, as though the memory of something long buried had been disturbed. At night, the couple found themselves thinking about it even when they tried not to. The wife admitted she dreamed of footsteps overhead, soft and measured, like someone pacing slowly back and forth. The husband began to notice faint drafts seeping through the cracks in the ceiling, carrying with them an odor he couldn't quite identify. Old wood, dust, something metallic, something almost sweet. They told themselves it was nothing, but both began avoiding the upper hallway, moving quickly past the door that led to the attic stairs. Finally, one weekend, the decision was made. Armed with crowbars and hammers, they cleared the insulation once more and set about prying loose the nails that sealed the door. Each pull of the crowbar sent echoes through the quiet house, the metallic squeal reverberating as though the walls themselves disapproved. When the last board gave way, they paused again, both breathing heavily, both reluctant to take the final step. The door swung open with a groan that seemed far too loud for the small space. A rush of air, stale and heavy, spilled out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of age. Dust swirled in the beam of their flashlight as the husband lifted it, casting light into the dark cavity beyond. For a moment, all they saw were rafters, cobwebs, and the sloping roof overhead. The attic looked like any other, unfinished wood, narrow beams, insulation scattered like brittle snow. But then, as the light shifted, shapes emerged. At first it was only the outline of boxes stacked haphazardly in one corner. But as they stepped inside, hearts thudding, the scene revealed itself in sharper detail. An old rocking chair, its paint chipped, stood facing the far wall. Beside it, a small table with a lamp, the bulb long dead. Papers were scattered across the floor as if dropped in a hurry. And there, against the beam, rested a child's toy, a small stuffed bear, one eye missing, its fabric stiff with time. The wife froze, staring at the toy as if it were a living thing. "This shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. The husband moved cautiously forward, his flashlight beam trembling across the space. He knelt by the boxes, brushing dust away from the top. One box contained children's clothes, folded neatly, though they had yellowed with age. Another held letters, handwritten, ink faded, envelopes addressed to names they both recognized from the whispers of the neighborhood, the mother and son who had disappeared in 1988. The silence in the attic seemed to deepen as they absorbed the weight of what they had found. This was not forgotten storage left behind by a careless owner. This was a sealed chamber of memory, deliberately hidden, deliberately avoided. Every object breathed of a life interrupted, trapped above their heads for decades. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The husband's flashlight beam drifted over the rocking chair, and for just a second, so quick he would later question if it was imagination, he thought he saw it shift slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. His breath caught, and he lowered the light quickly, not daring to look again. When they finally climbed back down, leaving the attic open behind them, they carried more than just dust on their clothes. They carried a presence, a feeling that the house was no longer simply theirs. The sealed attic had been a boundary, a line between the known and the unknown. In breaking it, they had crossed into something deeper, something far older than their ownership. And though they didn't yet realize it, their discovery was only the beginning. The attic had more to say. It had waited in silence for years, holding its secret like a breath caught in the chest. Now, with the door open, it had begun to exhale. The attic was no longer just a space above their heads. It had become a living presence, something that seeped into every conversation, every glance, every silence between the couple. What they had seen in that first exploration, the rocking chair, the bear, the neatly folded clothes, was enough to ignite an obsession. They could not pass a day without thinking about it. They spoke of the objects as though they were characters in a play, unfinished roles trapped in the rafters. And each time they returned to the attic, the air seemed heavier, the silence thicker, as though the space itself resented their intrusion. On their second visit, the wife brought a notebook. She wanted to catalog what they found, to make sense of the randomness. She listed the boxes, the letters, the scattered papers. But the more she wrote, the stranger it became. The handwriting on the letters was fragile, the ink faded, yet the words carried emotion. pleas, confessions, fragments of a life lived in unease. Some were unsent letters to friends, filled with loneliness and fear. Others appeared to be diary entries written on scraps of paper. A line that caught the wife's breath read, "I hear footsteps at night. He says it's only the house settling, but I know the sound of someone moving when they shouldn't be." The husband, meanwhile, was drawn to the objects themselves. He lifted the bear carefully, brushing away the dust. Though stiff and brittle, it still carried the faintest scent of fabric softener, a ghost of the child's presence. When he set it down, the bear toppled onto its side, landing face up as though staring at him. He quickly turned away, heart beating faster, unwilling to acknowledge the shiver that crawled down his spine. Deeper in the attic, more boxes revealed themselves. Inside one, they found dishes wrapped in newspaper dated 1987, the headlines mundane compared to the tragedy frozen within the house. Another box contained children's drawings, crayon sketches of stick figures standing beneath a bright sun, a small boy always holding the hand of a taller figure. In some drawings, a third figure appeared, looming larger, featureless, shaded heavily with black. The repetition of it unsettled them both. Was it just imagination? A child's shadow? Or something the boy believed he had seen? The rocking chair became its own kind of symbol. Each time they entered, it seemed to sit slightly differently, angled just a little askew, though neither admitted to moving it. Once, as they climbed the ladder, they swore they heard it creak, a slow rhythmic sound like the weight of someone shifting back and forth. By the time the flashlight beam reached it, the chair was still, unmoving, waiting. The couple began avoiding the attic at night, unable to shake the sense that the atmosphere changed after dark. The wife described it as charged, as if the air hummed faintly, pressing against her skin. The husband admitted he sometimes woke in the small hours of the morning with the distinct sensation that someone was moving above them. He would lie still, listening, convinced he heard the soft drag of feet across the wooden beams. But when he gathered the courage to climb up and check, nothing waited for him, only the same silent, dust-choked air. Neighbors noticed their change. The couple, once warm and talkative, became withdrawn, distracted. They no longer invited friends inside. When asked how the renovations were going, their answers were curt, vague. One neighbor joked that the house was eating them alive. The couple forced laughter, but neither denied it. What disturbed them most was the feeling that the attic was not merely holding objects, it was holding intent. The letters, when read together, painted a picture of a woman deeply unsettled in her final days. She wrote about noises in the night, about shadows on the staircase, about a creeping sense of being watched. Yet mixed in with the fear was a tone of resignation, as if she knew her fate was sealed. One line, scrawled across the margin of a page, stopped the wife cold. "If anything happens, it will begin here, in this attic." The attic was no longer simply a storage place, nor even a relic of a family lost. It had become a witness. The objects were testimonies, each one whispering a fragment of the story. But testimonies are dangerous things. They can shift, they can accuse, they can haunt. The husband suggested boxing everything up, handing it all over to the authorities, washing their hands of it. But the wife resisted. What if they don't listen? What if it just gets locked away again? She asked, her voice trembling. She couldn't bear the thought of the mother and son being silenced once more. She believed the attic wanted to be heard. Still, the couple could not agree on what the attic was truly saying. Was it a message of warning, a confession, or merely echoes of the past replaying themselves? Each night they lay awake, the ceiling above them pressing down like a weight. Each morning they awoke more tired, more hollow. And slowly, they began to feel that the attic was no longer confined to the top floor. Its presence leaked into the rest of the house, the sound of creaks in the hallway, the faint smell of dust in the kitchen, the sensation of eyes lingering at the edges of their vision. The sealed door had been a boundary. Now that it was open, the house itself seemed to breathe differently, as if some long-held exhalation was finally spilling through its rooms. They had uncovered the past, but the past was not content to stay in the attic. It had begun to follow them. The discoveries in the attic began to feel less like objects and more like fragments of a confession. Every letter, every misplaced toy, every page of a diary seemed to point not only to the lives of the missing mother and son, but also to the nights leading up to their disappearance. What at first felt like sentimental relics gradually transformed into evidence, as if the house itself had been preserving a case file that no one had asked for. The wife became the keeper of these fragments. Each evening she would spread them out on the dining table, careful not to tear the fragile paper, piecing the words together like a puzzle. Her notes filled an entire notebook, dates, quotes, sketches of how the attic had been arranged. The husband watched her from across the room, his unease deepening. He couldn't shake the thought that his wife was becoming entangled in something dangerous, as though the very act of reading the letters was binding her to the fate of the woman who wrote them. One diary entry, written shakily, stood out more than the rest. He doesn't knock anymore. He just stands there, waiting, listening. Sometimes I hear him at the attic door, breathing. I pray he never comes inside. The wife read those words aloud in a whisper, her voice trembling. When she looked up at her husband, his face was pale. "Who do you think she meant?" she asked. The question hung between them, unanswered. The husband wanted to believe the letters were simply the writings of an anxious mind. Stress, paranoia, perhaps even illness, anything that could explain away the sense of dread they carried. But the wife was not convinced. To her, the entries felt coherent, deliberate, almost prophetic. They weren't the ramblings of a fragile mind. They were warnings. The child's drawings became equally unsettling when viewed in this new light. The repeated dark figure looming beside the mother and boy no longer seemed like childish fantasy. What if he was drawing what he saw? The wife asked one night, tracing her finger over the crayon lines. The figure had no face, no features, just a black mass larger than the rest. The husband shook his head, insisting it was imagination. But in the quiet that followed, both silently acknowledged the possibility that the child had been trying to say something no adult had been willing to hear. As the couple dug deeper, they began cross-referencing the objects with public records, old news clippings, and neighborhood gossip. They learned details about the mother, her name, her routine, her friendships, that aligned eerily with the letters. They discovered that she had called the police once, weeks before she vanished, reporting noises in her home. The report had been dismissed as nerves. The officers had found nothing. The husband began to resist further digging, his nerves fraying. "We don't know what any of this means," he said more than once. "We're just filling gaps with our own fears." But the wife felt a growing responsibility, as though she had been chosen to give the woman and child their voices back. The attic had been sealed, hidden deliberately, and now it had been placed in her hands. She couldn't turn away. Stranger things began to happen in the house. One evening, while sorting through papers, the wife heard the unmistakable sound of a child laughing faintly above her head. She froze, staring at the ceiling. When she asked her husband if he'd heard it too, he said nothing, just turned pale and looked away. Another time, they both woke at the same moment in the middle of the night, convinced they had heard the rocking chair creaking steadily. Neither went upstairs to confirm. The atmosphere in the home grew tense. They snapped at each other more easily, conversations ending in silence. Yet even in their arguments, the attic lingered. It was always there, waiting. They began to feel watched, not by each other, not by neighbors, but by the very house. The wife confided in a neighbor, an older woman who had lived on the street since before 1988. The woman's expression tightened as soon as the attic was mentioned. "That family," she said quietly, "they were good people." But she was scared. I saw it in her eyes. She told me once she thought someone was coming into the house at night. I told her she should move. She said she couldn't. When pressed, the neighbor shook her head. After they vanished, nobody wanted to talk about it anymore. Too painful. Too strange. We all decided it was better not to know. Better not to know. Those words echoed in the wife's mind long after she returned home. But she did want to know. Every fiber of her being demanded it. The attic had waited decades for someone to listen. And now, the fragments were aligning into a darker suggestion. The disappearance had not been random. It had not been an accident. It was tied directly to the fears the mother had put into writing, to the faceless figure her son had drawn again and again. The couple sat together one night, the dining table littered with papers, the bear resting between them like a silent witness. "If these walls could talk," the husband muttered, his voice raw, "I think they'd tell us to run." But the wife shook her head. "No. They're telling us to stay. They're telling us to finish the story." Neither realized how close they were to uncovering the truth. The attic was not finished with them. It had more to reveal, something that would finally explain what had happened in 1988. Something they could never unsee. The attic's silence had become unbearable. It wasn't merely an empty quiet, it was the kind of silence that feels occupied, a silence that listens. The wife could no longer walk through the house without imagining what lingered above her head. She began to move with a nervous purpose, always aware of the attic door at the top of the stairs. The husband tried to keep his distance, retreating into work, into distractions, into denial. But the wife was relentless. She believed the attic still had more to show them, and she was right. One evening, While the wind rattled the windows and rain tapped against the roof, she climbed the ladder again, flashlight trembling in her grip. The husband called up after her, asking why she couldn't just leave it alone. She didn't answer. When her head breached the opening, she felt the attic's stale breath spill over her. It smelled stronger than before: dust, rot, something sour, like metal left to rust. The rocking chair sat where it always had, tilted slightly, as though caught mid-motion. The bear lay in the same place, its button eye glinting faintly in the flashlight beam. The papers remained scattered, the drawings pale against the wood.